The new wife of my ex-husband was standing on my porch, a predator's smile plastered on her face, and she said, "We've come to collect what belongs to us. You need to give us the house." I took a step to the side, allowing my attorney to glide past me, carrying a stack of papers that made the color drain from her face. It was an ordinary Thursday morning when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting a soul. To be honest, I had stopped expecting much of anything recently, as my life had been quietly reshaping itself into something I could never have foreseen just months prior. The common chime of the doorbell echoed through my home, a simple everyday sound that somehow managed to send my pulse into a frantic rhythm. I swung the door open without a second thought, half assuming it was a package delivery, or maybe a neighbor needing to borrow a cup of sugar. But instead, standing there in the crisp morning air was a person I recognized far too well. Isabel, my ex-husband's new wife, was on my doorstep with a wide grin. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd give a friend during a casual visit. No, this one was different. It was smug, dripping with a calculated confidence. She was flanked by a man in a dark, impeccable suit who looked more suited for a hostile takeover than a morning chat. His tie was perfectly knotted, but it was his eyes that really defined him. They held the cold, detached gaze of someone accustomed to winning at all costs. This wasn't a friendly visit. This wasn't them coming to make amends. "Good morning, Clara," Isabel said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that did nothing to hide the sharpness in her eyes. "We're here to collect what belongs to us. You need to give us the house." Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to take a moment to thank you all for being here. Your support means the world. If you find yourself drawn to stories about resilience, fighting for what's right, and finding strength in adversity, please consider subscribing. It's completely free and it helps us bring more of these incredible journeys to you. Now, let's get back to it. Her words struck me like a physical blow, so sudden and cruel that for a beat, my mind couldn't even form a response. What on earth was she talking about? My house, the home where my children had grown up. I just stared at her, utter disbelief washing over me. The words felt like they belonged in a nightmare, not on my front porch. My life had already been shattered when Mark left me for Isabel, but this was a new level of audacity. How dare they show up here making these demands, acting as if they had any right to the sanctuary I had painstakingly built over the years? "Excuse me?" I finally managed to get out, my voice quivering, though I wasn't sure if it was from fear or pure, unadulterated rage at her nerve. Isabel took a confident step forward, her lawyer shadowing her every move. She looked me up and down, that unwavering smirk still in place. "You heard me. We've come to take what's ours. You know Mark and I are entitled to everything he's worked for, and this house is a significant part of his assets." A cold, hard knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I had heard whispers of their plans, but I never imagined they would be so brazen, so public with their attack. Mark had made it painfully clear through his actions that he no longer saw me as his partner. But this was a declaration of war. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I didn't know what I'd expected from Isabel, but I certainly hadn't expected this level of ruthlessness. She had always played the part of the poor, innocent victim in front of Mark, the one who needed saving. And now, here she was, lawyer in tow, demanding I surrender my life. But I wasn't going to just stand there and let it happen. I wasn't the same woman I was when Mark walked out the door. Oh no, I had grown. I had learned. And most importantly, I had prepared. I had a plan, and it was finally time to put it into motion. I stepped aside, letting the door swing open a little wider, and without uttering a single word, I allowed my attorney to step past me and into the entryway. The change in Isabel's expression was instantaneous. The smile faltered just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I saw it. The control she thought she had was slipping. My attorney, Rachel, was holding a thick manila folder filled with legal documents. As she entered the room, I watched Isabel's eyes dart from Rachel's determined face down to the papers. Her smug confidence began to visibly crumble, and I felt a spark of something deep inside me, satisfaction maybe, or even profound relief. This was not going to be the easy victory Isabel had envisioned. "Rachel," Isabel stammered, her voice suddenly stripped of its earlier arrogance. "What is this?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She simply held out the papers. Isabel took them with a reluctant, trembling hand and began to flip through them. Her expression shifted from confusion to outright panic in a matter of seconds. All the color drained from her cheeks as she absorbed the words on the page. The lawyer beside her went rigid, his eyes flitting between Isabel and the documents she was clutching. "What is this?" Isabel asked again, her voice now laced with a desperate uncertainty. I didn't have to say a thing. Rachel, ever calm and collected, spoke for me. "These are the legal documents that prove unequivocally that this house remains in Clara's name. All of Mark's attempts to transfer ownership to you have been legally nullified. You are not getting this house, Isabel." For a moment, a heavy silence filled the space. Isabel's eyes narrowed, her fingers gripping the papers with a mix of disbelief and fury. The lawyer next to her shot her a glance, as if waiting for a command, but Isabel was frozen. "I don't believe this," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. Her gaze flicked back to me, and in that instant, I saw it again. The same entitlement that had fueled her affair with my husband, the same self-assurance that made her believe she could take whatever she wanted. It was all cracking. "You can't do this," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "Mark will never stand for this. I cut her off, the weight of the moment finally settling into my bones and giving me strength. "Mark isn't here, Isabel, and frankly, I don't need his permission to defend what is mine. You are not taking this house. You are not taking anything else from me." The words felt like a victory on my tongue. I had been rehearsing this moment in my head for months, and now it was finally real. The anger that had been simmering inside me for so long, anger at the betrayal, the lies, the years I spent feeling powerless, was finally boiling over, but it was a controlled burn. "Leave," I said, my voice now perfectly steady. "I don't want to see you on my property again. This is over." Isabel's face twisted with frustration, her earlier confidence completely shattered. But before she could muster a response, Rachel stepped forward, holding out one last piece of paper that would seal their fate. "Unless you want to make this significantly more difficult for yourselves," Rachel said coolly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You'll leave now. Otherwise, our next conversation will be in a courtroom." Isabel didn't reply. She just stared at the papers one last time, and in that fleeting moment, I saw something I hadn't expected to see on her face. Defeat. It was brief, but it was unmistakable. Her smile had vanished completely, replaced by the stark realization that she had lost. She was not going to win this fight. Without another word, Isabel spun on her heel, her lawyer scrambling to follow. As they made their hurried exit down my walkway, I couldn't help but feel a strange cocktail of triumph and emptiness. I had won, yes, but at what cost? As the front door clicked shut behind them, I leaned against it, letting out a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. The war was far from over, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was back in control of my own life, and it felt damn good. The sound of the door clicking shut behind Isabel and her lawyer should have been a symphony of relief. The tension that had been squeezing my chest finally began to loosen its grip, but it wasn't enough to soothe the deep ache that had been building inside me for months. This victory, if you could even call it that, felt hollow. It was one of those moments where you win the battle, but you know the war is far from over. I stood there in the sudden quiet of my entryway, just staring at the empty space they had occupied, as if their toxic presence had left a permanent stain on the air. But the truth is, My fight had started long before they showed up on my doorstep. Isabel's smug face, that stone-cold lawyer, the words they had spat at me, they were just the final ugly pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for over a year. The last few months had been a chaotic whirlwind, but my world had been knocked off its axis long before that. You see, Mark wasn't just my ex-husband, he was my partner, the father of my children, and for 15 years, he had been the son my entire universe revolved around. We had built something real together, a life, a home, a family. And for the longest time, I genuinely believed we were invincible. We weren't a perfect couple, of course. No one is. But I had always thought that whatever life threw at us, we would find a way to navigate it together. That was the promise we made. That was the belief I held on to, until Isabel floated into the picture. At first, it wasn't some dramatic, obvious affair. Isabel was just another colleague at one of Mark's corporate events. He spoke highly of her work ethic, and I'd see her occasionally at company dinners or school fundraisers. She was younger than me, sure, but that wasn't the issue. She was bubbly, engaging, and seemed utterly harmless. At least, that's how she presented herself to the world. To me, she was just another face in a crowded room. It wasn't until Mark started working late more frequently, making flimsy excuses, and becoming emotionally distant that I began to feel the ground shift beneath me. I remember the first time he came home with a chill in his demeanor, a look in his eyes I'd never seen before. I asked him what was wrong, and he just brushed it off. "I'm just stressed with work, Clara. It's nothing." But I knew. It was that gut feeling, that primal instinct you get when something is fundamentally wrong in your world. Days bled into weeks, and Mark's behavior grew more and more erratic. I found myself questioning him more, double-checking his schedule, calling him when he didn't come home on time. The cracks in our marriage were beginning to spiderweb across the surface, but I was in denial. I loved him. I trusted him. I didn't want to see the truth that was right in front of my face. But when I finally found out about Isabel, everything came crashing down. It wasn't a single sudden revelation. It was more like a slow, agonizing burn, a fire that had been smoldering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to erupt. I was never the type to snoop, but I couldn't keep ignoring the glaring signs. A late-night text message left open on his phone, an unfamiliar number in his call log with a heart emoji next to it, a message that read, "Can't wait for tonight." That was the moment the floor fell out from under me. At first, I didn't confront him. I wasn't ready to face the reality I already knew to be true. I needed time to process it, to come to terms with the fact that the perfect life I thought I had was a complete illusion. The man I had loved for half my life, the man I had given everything to, had been lying to my face. I felt like such a fool. How could I have been so blind? How did I miss it? But the evidence was undeniable. Isabel wasn't just some casual fling. She was real, and she had woven herself into Mark's life in a way I could never have anticipated. She wasn't just another face in the crowd anymore. She had become his confidant, his partner in crime, and over time, she had stolen the place I thought was reserved for me in his heart. When I finally confronted him, the conversation was every bit as devastating as I had feared. Mark denied it at first, of course, claiming it was all a huge misunderstanding. But the guilt in his eyes was a dead giveaway. The truth eventually spilled out in a torrent of excuses and half-apologies. And just like that, the life we had built together was reduced to rubble. He confessed to the affair, a secret relationship with Isabel that had been going on for much longer than I had suspected. My heart didn't just break, it shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to lash out, but all I could do was cry. It wasn't just the affair itself that hurt so deeply, it was everything that came after. The cascade of lies, the profound betrayal, the cold, empty look in his eyes when he told me he didn't love me anymore. The worst part, though, wasn't even losing him. It was losing the life we had shared, the family we had built, the home we had made together, And to pour salt in the wound, Isabel wasn't some anonymous stranger. She was someone Mark had chosen over me, someone who had entered my life without an invitation and with a complete disregard for the family we had raised. I had always imagined that if Mark and I ever separated, it would be a mutual decision, a gentle growing apart where we would part ways as friends. But this wasn't mutual, this wasn't peaceful, this was a hostile takeover, a gut-wrenching reminder that sometimes love just isn't enough. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I had to figure out how to pick up the broken pieces of my life. I knew what Mark wanted. He wanted to move on, to erase the years we had spent together and start a new, shiny life with Isabel. And somewhere along the way, he had decided that I was no longer worth fighting for. But I wasn't ready to let go of everything. I couldn't. The thought of losing my home, the place where my children took their first steps, was too much to bear. I couldn't just let him waltz in with Isabel and seize everything we had built. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything they were trying to strip away from me, my dignity, my identity, my future. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't going to surrender without a fight. I wasn't going to let Isabel's greedy smile be the last thing I remembered. I wasn't going to let her walk away with my life without understanding the consequences of her actions. Just as Mark had chosen Isabel, I had to choose myself. I had to fight for my children's future, for their security, and for my own peace of mind. As I stood in the doorway that morning, watching Isabel and her lawyer retreat in defeat, I knew this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, but I had taken the first crucial step in reclaiming what was mine. I had taken back control, and I was ready for whatever came next. I was not going to let them win, not this time. The sound of Isabel and her lawyer's retreating footsteps should have been a triumphant melody, but it wasn't. It felt more like the quiet before an even bigger storm. The weight of everything they had tried to take from me seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. I stood there in the profound silence that followed, trying to catch my breath. I was finally in control, yes, but a strange, gnawing emptiness persisted. Was this really over, or had they just begun their campaign to seize what they believed was theirs? I tried to push those thoughts away, to focus on the present victory. I had won a small battle today, but there was still so much unresolved pain to deal with. Mark's betrayal had shattered me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. It wasn't just the affair, it was the entire life we had built together, the future I had envisioned for us. All of it turned to dust in an instant. But the hardest part was the deceit, the endless lies, the trust I had given him so completely, only to have it weaponized and used against me. As the days went by, the true weight of his betrayal settled deeper into my soul. I kept telling myself to focus on the present, to be strong for myself, for my kids. But every time I looked at the walls of my house, walls that had once felt like a sanctuary, I couldn't escape the ghost of his betrayal. The memories of our life together played on a constant, painful loop in my mind. The shared laughter, the quiet evenings, the whispered promises of forever, now just broken fragments of a past that no longer felt real. Mark had left me for Isabel, yes, but it was more than that. He hadn't just fallen out of love, he had actively turned against me. I could feel it in the way he spoke to me after the truth came out, the coldness in his voice, the chilling indifference that had replaced the warmth we once shared. He didn't just want a new life with Isabel. He wanted to erase me from his history entirely, and that, more than the affair itself, was what hurt the most. I thought I had prepared myself for the confrontation, but no amount of mental preparation could have shielded me from the emotional devastation. I spent countless days and sleepless nights dissecting our past, trying to pinpoint where I had gone wrong. Was I not enough? Had I failed him in some way? The self-doubt gnawed at me relentlessly, but deep down, a stronger voice was beginning to emerge, telling me the truth. This wasn't about me. This was about Mark and his own selfish choices. I wasn't the problem. He was. And then there was Isabel. At first, I had tried to dismiss her, to relegate her to the role of the other woman. But as time went on, it became sickeningly clear that she wasn't going anywhere. She had become more than a temporary distraction for Mark. She was his future. And that thought filled me with a kind of cold fury I hadn't known I was capable of. I could feel her eyes on me in every public interaction we were forced to have. Her smug smile, a constant reminder of what she had taken. And then I realized something crucial. She wasn't just taking Mark. She was aiming to take everything: my family, my home, my entire sense of stability. The moment Isabel stood on my doorstep with that arrogant smirk demanding my house, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just a simple betrayal of trust. It was a full-scale assault on my very identity. She was trying to rewrite our history, to erase me from the narrative as if I had never mattered. But I was not going to let her. I had spent too long playing the victim in this drama, letting Mark and Isabel dictate the terms of my life. It was time to take back the pen and write my own story. But despite my newfound resolve, the emotional turmoil was a constant battle. I couldn't stop my mind from replaying how easily Mark had discarded me, how effortlessly he had left our shared life behind. There were moments when I questioned everything: my worth, my judgment, my ability to ever trust anyone again. The doubts whispered to me in the darkest hours of the night, and I could feel myself slipping back into that dangerous spiral of self-blame that had consumed me when I first found out. And yet, amid all the turmoil, there was a small, defiant spark within me that refused to be extinguished. I had been through hell. I had been lied to, betrayed, and abandoned. But I was still here. I was still standing. And that realization, however small, became my lifeline. The betrayal had hurt more than words could ever express, but I was not going to let it define me. I was not going to let it destroy me. One night, as I sat in the stillness of my living room, the full weight of the situation finally settled on me in a new way. This wasn't just about Isabel or Mark anymore. It was about me. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my future. I had spent far too long letting their actions define my worth. I needed to find my own strength again. I needed to remember who I was, completely independent of them, of the life they had tried to take from me. I began to piece together a plan, a strategy to take back control not just of my home, but of my entire life. I reached out to my lawyer, Rachel, who had been a rock of stability throughout this entire ordeal. Together, we began to explore every legal avenue available to me. There were loopholes I hadn't known existed, legal paths I hadn't thought to take. And as we sat in her office poring over stacks of documents, something shifted inside me. I wasn't just fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting for my future. I was fighting for the woman I was determined to become, the one who refused to be pushed around. And then came the revelation that shook me to my core. As we dug deeper into Mark's finances, we uncovered something completely unexpected, something that had been cleverly hidden beneath layers of transactions. Mark had been systematically funneling money into a secret account under Isabel's name. This wasn't just a love affair, this was a calculated financial betrayal. He had been making plans to leave me with absolutely nothing, to start his new life with her on a foundation built from our shared assets, without a single thought for the consequences of his actions. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly everything fell into place. This wasn't just about love or lust, this was about power. Mark had been building a future with Isabel where I had no part, no security, no voice. But I was not going to let that happen. I was not going to let him take everything from me, my home, my family, my peace of mind. The truth was, I didn't need Mark or Isabel to define me. I had the strength to stand on my own 2 feet. The days that followed were filled with a potent mix of anger, frustration, and a steely determination. I had spent so long being consumed by their betrayal, by the raw pain of what they had done, that I had forgotten to focus on myself. But now, as I delved into the legal intricacies of my case, I realized something. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. It was about reclaiming my life, my future, and my independence. Isabel and Mark had severely underestimated me. They thought they could walk all over me, take what was mine, and leave me in the dust. But they were deeply, deeply mistaken. I was ready to fight back, and this time, I was going to win. The weight of the discovery about Mark's hidden financial dealings with Isabel didn't sink in all at once. At first, it was just another piece of the puzzle, another thread I could pull to unravel the intricate web of lies they had spun around me. But as I sat there with Rachel, going over every detail we had uncovered, the full picture became terrifyingly clear. This was so much bigger than I had imagined. This wasn't just about a midlife crisis affair. It wasn't just about the house or the sting of betrayal. It was about power, control, and a cold-blooded attempt to strip me of everything I had worked for and contributed to our marriage. Mark thought he could seamlessly transition to his new life with Isabel, leaving me financially crippled and powerless. He was wrong. The revelation of the secret account was a game changer. It wasn't just the money itself, it was the malicious intent behind it. Mark had been siphoning off our joint funds for months, ensuring that when our marriage finally imploded, Isabel would have a comfortable cushion to land on, while I would be left scrambling to survive. This wasn't just a shrewd financial maneuver, it was a declaration of war. And as much as I hated to admit it, it was the final wake-up call I needed. I had spent far too long languishing in the role of the wronged wife, too long feeling helpless and victimized. But I was done with that. I wasn't going to just stand by and watch while Mark and Isabel built their future on the ruins of mine. I had a plan, and it was about more than just reclaiming what was mine. It was about showing them that I was not someone they could discard and forget. I was going to make them pay for every lie, every deceit, every single betrayal that had chipped away at the life I once knew. The first step in my counteroffensive was to gather as much information as possible. Rachel and I spent days meticulously sifting through every financial record Mark had left behind, searching for any more hidden accounts, any other signs that this conspiracy went even deeper. Every email, every bank statement, every credit card transaction was a clue. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Mark had been plotting this for a very long time. He had carefully constructed a new life with Isabel, one that had no room for me, but I refused to let him get away with it, not after everything we had been through. The next step was the legal assault. I couldn't just storm back into Mark's life and demand what was rightfully mine. That would only lead to more conflict and frustration. Instead, I had to use the system to my advantage. We filed an emergency motion to freeze his assets, to put an immediate hold on the secret account he'd been building for Isabel, and to ensure he couldn't hide anything else from the court. It wasn't a complete victory, not yet, but it was a start. It was the first strategic blow in what was shaping up to be a much larger battle. The hardest part of this whole process, however, wasn't the legal drudgery. It wasn't the endless hours of paperwork, the long calls with Rachel, or the late nights spent on research. It was watching Mark continue to play the part of the devoted partner to Isabel, pretending that everything was fine while I was fighting for my future. He seemed completely unconcerned with the damage he had caused, the lives he had upended. He was too busy reveling in his new life, his fresh start, to even consider the wreckage he had left in his wake. That was where the real pain festered, but I was not going to let that pain consume me. I had made a fragile peace with the fact that Mark would never be the man I once thought he was. But what I could not accept was the idea that he could get away with it all, scot-free. He couldn't just detonate my life, take everything we had built, and then waltz off into the sunset with Isabel. He needed to understand the true consequences of his actions, and I was going to be the one to teach him that lesson. I spent hours meticulously crafting my plan of attack, thinking through every possible angle, every detail. This wasn't going to be an impulsive, reckless act of revenge. No, this was going to be calculated, precise, and utterly devastating. I wanted Mark to feel the full, crushing weight of his betrayal, and I wanted Isabel to understand that her role in this destruction would not go unpunished. They thought they could outsmart me, take what was mine without facing any repercussions, but I had news for them. They were wrong. My plan began to take shape. I would continue to press forward aggressively with the legal battle, but I would also use the emotional and social leverage I now had. Mark and Isabel didn't know it yet, but they were about to be blindsided. I had information on them, information that would not only turn the tables, but would shatter the carefully constructed world they were so proud of. But it wasn't just about taking them down, it was about showing them, and myself, that I was not someone to be underestimated. I had one final piece of the puzzle: Isabel. She thought she had won, that she had everything she ever wanted, but I knew she was just as vulnerable as Mark. She had her own secrets, things she had desperately tried to keep buried. And I was going to use those secrets to my advantage. I couldn't just hurt Mark. Isabel needed to feel the sting of betrayal, too. She had stolen something from me that could never be replaced, and now it was her turn to pay the price. The moment finally arrived when I had everything in place. I had gathered enough evidence to bring them both down, but I knew the timing had to be perfect. I couldn't afford a single misstep. It had to be executed in a way that would leave no room for escape, no way for them to wriggle out of the consequences. I had spent months preparing for this moment. I set the trap, careful to cover every angle. The final blow came when I strategically leaked the information to a well-connected journalist, ensuring that Mark and Isabel would be forced to confront the fallout of their actions on a public stage. The result was immediate and more explosive than I could have hoped for. The press coverage was relentless, and the legal repercussions were severe. Mark and Isabel were finally forced to face the truth, and it was a truth they could no longer run from. As I watched it all unfold, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about taking back control of my story, my life, my future. I had made them feel a fraction of the pain they had caused me, and in doing so, I had begun to free myself from the chains of their betrayal. They had thought they could take everything from me, but in the end, it was I who would have the last laugh. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. As I watched the fallout from the information I had leaked to the press, I realized something profound. The satisfaction I thought I would feel from exposing Mark and Isabel was there, but it was a muted, complicated emotion. This wasn't the kind of victory that fills you with pure joy. It was bittersweet, like winning a battle but being acutely aware of the high cost of the war. Still, a part of me couldn't deny the surge of power that came with seeing their carefully constructed world begin to crumble. The media firestorm had been explosive. Mark's pristine public image, the one he had spent years cultivating, was shattered in an instant. The affair, the secret accounts, the calculated lies, it was all laid bare for the world to see. His phone began ringing off the hook with calls from reporters, furious investors, and former friends who now wanted nothing to do with him. Isabel, too, was thrust into a spotlight she never wanted. She had been lurking in the shadows, thinking she could slide into Mark's life without any consequences. But now, her every move was scrutinized. The guilt she had managed to bury so deep was now plastered across her face for everyone to judge. For the first time, she was the one being judged, and there was nowhere to hide. But what I hadn't anticipated was how quickly the tide could turn. In the midst of all this chaos, when I thought I finally had the upper hand, something happened that caught me completely off guard. A phone call. It was from Mark's lawyer, a man I hadn't expected to hear from directly, and it came at the exact moment I thought I had nothing left to fear. "I know what you've done, Clara." The lawyer's voice was cold, calculating. "But you should be very careful. You're not as untouchable as you think you are." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I was frozen. Was this the moment where everything I had fought for started to unravel? The lawyer continued, his voice laced with a thinly veiled threat. "You've made a serious mistake. We're going to countersue. You've crossed a line, and I promise you, this is far from over." The lawyer's words hung in the air, and my mind began to race. For a second, I couldn't think straight. I had been so focused on making Mark and Isabel pay for what they had done, so consumed by taking back control, that I hadn't seriously considered the possibility of them retaliating in ways I hadn't foreseen. They weren't going to go down without a fight. The unexpected threat loomed over me like a dark cloud, but it didn't shake me. It didn't scare me. If anything, it only fueled the fire inside me. I had come too far to back down now. I had spent too long rebuilding my strength, pulling myself together after the devastation, to let a legal threat derail me. No, this wasn't the time for fear. It was time to push back harder. But what Mark and his lawyer didn't know was that I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. Rachel, my lawyer, had become more than just a legal advisor. She had become my ally, my confidant, someone I trusted completely. Together, we had meticulously planned every move. We had prepared for every contingency, every potential setback. And even if they were going to countersue, we were ready for them. But the legal battle wasn't my only concern. In the days that followed, the emotional weight of what I had done began to settle in. I wasn't just exposing their lies anymore. I was actively dismantling their lives. A part of me had relished watching their world fall apart, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something critical. I was in danger of becoming the very thing I despised. Mark had made me feel powerless, insignificant, as if I were nothing more than a footnote in his grand story. And in my desperate attempt to reclaim my life, to prove that I was more than just his discarded wife, I had started to lose sight of my own moral compass. I wasn't just fighting for revenge anymore. I was fighting for my sense of self, for my dignity. But in the process, I had become consumed by the need to inflict pain. I had let their betrayal define the person I was becoming. One night, as I sat alone in my living room, reflecting on the whirlwind of events, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could continue down this scorched earth path, letting the bitterness and anger drive me to do things I might later regret. Or I could take a step back and find a way to let go. I knew I could never truly move on unless I made peace with myself. But how could I do that when my entire strategy had been built on a foundation of vengeance? The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of clarity. I was done fighting. Not in the way you might think, though. I wasn't going to drop the legal battle. I wasn't going to let Mark or Isabel get away with what they had done. But I was going to let go of the anger. I wasn't going to let it control me anymore. I refused to let them take the one thing I had left: my peace. The court proceedings continued, and with Rachel's expert guidance, we won a key ruling that put me in an even stronger position. Mark and Isabel were being forced to face the full consequences of their actions. But something unexpected happened during the final stages of the legal battle. Mark, completely broken by the public fallout, the loss of his business, and the relentless pressure from the media, came to me. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a gesture of reconciliation. It was a desperate plea for mercy. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, Clara," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you, but everything just spiraled out of control. I made terrible mistakes, and now I'm paying the price." These were not the words I had ever expected to hear from him. I had thought that when the time came, I would find satisfaction in his downfall. But now, As I looked into his eyes, I realized something. His suffering wasn't what I had truly wanted. What I had wanted was justice. Yes, but more than that, I had wanted him to understand. I wanted him to feel the weight of the choices he had made, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of the family we had once been. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me, Mark," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "But you did, and now you have to face the consequences, not just legally, but personally. You can't keep running from what you've done." In that moment, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't anticipated. Mark had been a part of my life for so long, and the pain he had caused was a burden I had carried for far too long. But now, as I looked at the broken man in front of me, I realized that I was finally free. Free from the bitterness, free from the revenge that had consumed me. I didn't need his apology anymore. I didn't need him to fix anything. I had already done that for myself. As I walked away from that encounter, I realized that the revenge was not the victory I had thought it would be. The true victory was in the strength I had discovered within myself. In the process of tearing down everything Mark and Isabel had built, I had rebuilt myself, and in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered. The morning after Mark's desperate plea was like an awakening. I had no idea what I expected when I first set out on this journey of confrontation and vengeance, but in that quiet moment outside the courthouse, it was crystal clear. I was not the same person I had been when this all began. The rage and bitterness that had been the fuel for my every move seemed to have finally burned out. And though the legal battle was not quite over, I could feel a profound shift inside me. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something very close. I watched as the world continued to react to Mark and Isabel's spectacular downfall. The media frenzy was relentless, and for the first time, Mark was not in control of the narrative. The public fallout was every bit as explosive as I had once hoped. But now, as I watched it unfold, I felt something I hadn't anticipated at all: a flicker of empathy. The harsh reality of their lives completely falling apart didn't fill me with the righteous satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, it forced me to reflect on everything I had lost in the process. Mark and Isabel weren't the only ones suffering. I was too. We all were, in our own ways. The legal proceedings dragged on, but something inside me had fundamentally changed. As much as I wanted to see Mark held accountable for his actions, a part of me began to feel a strange sort of pity for him. He was unraveling right before my eyes. His reputation was in tatters. His financial stability was non-existent, and worst of all, he had lost the respect of our children. I could see it in their eyes whenever they spoke of him, the way his absence weighed on them, how the hollow shell of the man he had become left them confused and hurt. The realization came slowly, like the sun rising after a long, dark night. I had spent so much time and energy seeking revenge, seeking validation for all the pain and betrayal I had endured. But the truth was, I didn't need to see Mark suffer to feel the consequences of his actions. His own choices had already done that. His life was already in ruins. In that sense, he was getting exactly what he deserved. I didn't need to be the one to administer the final blow. Life was doing that for me. That was the moment I knew. I didn't need to keep fighting him. I didn't need to prolong this war any longer. It was time to move on, not for his sake, but for mine. But the final twist in this saga came when I least expected it. In the midst of preparing for our final court date, I received an urgent call from Rachel. Her voice was calm, almost too calm as she spoke. "Clara, I need you to sit down. I've just received some new information. It's about Mark, and it changes everything." For a moment, my heart hammered against my ribs. Had something new come to light? Had Mark tried to pull one last desperate trick? I braced myself for whatever was coming, but I could never have prepared for what Rachel said next. "It's about the trust fund," she continued. The one Mark set up for the kids. The one we all thought was just a standard savings plan. It turns out he's been funneling a significant portion of his hidden earnings into it, but not for their benefit. My mind went into overdrive. I felt like I couldn't breathe as I processed the implications. The money Mark had been hiding wasn't just for Isabel. It wasn't just for him. It was for something else entirely. Something that would have destroyed my case if it had come to light under different circumstances. Rachel explained further. Mark transferred a huge portion of his wealth to the kids' trust fund, but not with the intention of securing their future. He was using it as a bargaining chip, Clara, a way to control you. His plan was that once it was discovered, you would be forced to accept his terms for the settlement, for splitting the assets, for everything. The betrayal took on a new, more sinister shape. Mark had never truly planned to leave me empty-handed. He had been playing a sick, twisted game all along, using our own children as pawns in a strategy to manipulate me into accepting whatever crumbs he decided to throw my way. "Does the money still exist?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. This was a game changer. Mark had been setting me up to fail, but in his arrogance, he had made a fatal mistake. Rachel's response was as calm and clear as ever. "Yes, it exists, but now it's under our control. We can claim it, and with this new evidence of his intent to defraud you, we can force a much, much more favorable settlement." The news hit me like a tidal wave. For the first time, I understood the immense power I now held. I had been so focused on Mark's romantic betrayal, on getting back at him for the emotional damage, that I had overlooked the one thing he never saw coming. His own greed and manipulation had left him completely vulnerable, and I now had the leverage to turn the tables on him completely. I didn't waste a second. The following weeks were a blur of new paperwork, new meetings, and a renewed, focused sense of purpose. The narrative that Mark had so carefully tried to craft for himself was no longer his to control. The truth was, finally, unequivocally on my side, and now it was time to make him face the music. When the final court date arrived, I walked into that courtroom with my head held high. The strength I had built over the past year was palpable. I wasn't the broken woman I had been when this all started. I wasn't the woman who cried herself to sleep, wondering if she would ever find peace again. I had found it, not in revenge, not in watching Mark's life fall apart, but in reclaiming my own power and my own dignity. Mark sat across from me, a pale shadow of the man I had once known. His eyes, once so full of arrogance and entitlement, now betrayed a raw fear. The same man who thought he could control everything, who had tried to manipulate me and our children for his own gain, was now looking at me as if I held his entire world in my hands. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated clarity. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for my children, and for the future we would build without him. When the judge delivered the final ruling, it was decisive. Everything Mark had tried to manipulate, everything he had tried to hide, was being handed back to me. The trust fund was now legally mine, as were the assets he had tried to claim. But more than that, my children's future was secure. I had fought not just for material wealth, but for the integrity of our family. And in the end, that integrity had been my greatest weapon. As I walked out of the courtroom that day, the unbearable weight that had once been crushing my shoulders seemed to simply lift and dissipate into the air. I didn't feel victorious in the way I had once imagined. I didn't need to. The real victory wasn't in the money or the assets. It was in the peace I had finally found. And in that peace, I realized that true justice had been served, not just in the courtroom, but in my own heart. End of story. Mark began his presentation with his usual charisma, his voice filling the room. He was brilliant, I had to admit, passionate and convincing. 20 minutes in, I saw him. The process server, a nondescript man in a simple suit, entered and positioned himself near the front. As Mark was wrapping up a point about innovative brand synergy, the server stood and walked purposefully toward the stage. The movement broke Mark's rhythm. He paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face at the interruption. "Mark Preston," the server announced, his voice ringing out in the suddenly quiet room. "You've been served." The thick manila envelope was placed directly in Mark's hands. The room fell silent. 70 pairs of eyes were fixed on the unfolding drama. Mark's face was a rapid-fire sequence of emotions. Confusion, then dawning recognition as he saw my name on the documents, then sheer gut-wrenching horror. "What is this?" he stammered, his confident voice cracking. His hands shook as he tore it open, his eyes scanning the detailed allegations of financial fraud, conspiracy, and adultery, complete with copies of his own emails. The color drained from his face. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Isabella moved toward him, trying to see the papers, her face a mask of confusion. That's when I stood up. "That's for conspiracy to commit financial fraud and theft of marital assets," I announced, my voice carrying across the silent space with perfect clarity. "Turns out your sweet, naive artist wife learned how to protect her compositions." Every head turned toward me. I saw the moment of realization on the faces of his colleagues, the uncomfortable shifting of the clients. Mark stared at me, his expression a mixture of shock, humiliation, and a dawning, belated understanding of the woman he had so profoundly misjudged. But the server wasn't done. He turned to Isabella. "Isabella Vance," he stated, his tone just as loud and clear. "You've been served as well." Her corporate mask shattered as she was handed her own envelope, detailing her ethics violations, abuse of power, and complicity in the fraud. Her face went ashen as she realized her career had just ended in the most public way imaginable. The room was frozen in a state of scandalized shock. 2 careers, 2 lives imploding in real time before a captive audience. As Mark and Isabella were learning, consequences don't care how clever you think you are. They only care about evidence. I turned and walked out of the room, my head held high, leaving them to the ruins of the life they had built on my back. 4 months later, the legal victory was complete. Diana's strategy had been flawless. Mark left our marriage with nothing but his clothes and a professional reputation so toxic he had to leave the state. The court awarded me the cottage, all our financial assets, and a significant portion of his retirement funds as restitution for his systematic fraud. "I've rarely seen a defendant so thoroughly self-incriminate," Diana remarked at our final meeting. The civil suit against both Mark and Isabella resulted in a substantial settlement for punitive damages and emotional distress. Isabella was forced to resign, her executive career permanently derailed. My own life, however, began to blossom. News of the divorce spread, but instead of pity, I found respect. My cello studio exploded, my roster of students doubling in 3 months. The settlement allowed me to convert our sunroom into a magnificent music studio, with a new grand piano overlooking Serenity Cove. My own compositions took on a new depth, pieces about resilience and transformation. I started a truth box, a wooden chest where I kept mementos of my real life, my teaching certificate, thank you notes from students, and Diana's business card. It also held a letter from Eva. "Watching you handle that situation with such strength and dignity reminded me why I had to reach out," she wrote. "You make the world safer for the rest of us." Spring brought an unexpected connection. I met Samuel Reed, the owner of a local independent bookstore. He was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in my music, not as a hobby, but as my life's work. Our conversations were about books and music and the quiet joy of a life built on passion, not ambition. His admiration felt real after years of Mark's polite condescension. The betrayal had taught me to hear the difference between performed sentiment and authentic emotion. It had revealed a strength in me I never knew I possessed. I wasn't just an artist. I was a strategist, a fighter, a woman who had been playing a smaller version of herself to fit into someone else's life. 6 months after Mark's public downfall, I performed an original piece at the annual Arts Festival. It was called Serenity Cove Sunrise, a melody about watching the day begin, knowing it belonged completely to you. In the audience, Samuel listened with an understanding that went beyond words. My life now contained only authentic melodies, genuine relationships, and the deep, quiet peace that comes from knowing you wrote the score yourself. The girl who once crafted a gift for a lyre had become a woman who created her own world, on her own terms. This was what victory truly looked like, not just winning a battle, but finally discovering the music that had been inside you all along. End of story.